Some mysteries lie not in what is seen, but in what is believed. It begins with a dinner at an ancestral hall where a 13th chair is drawn reluctantly to the table, and a single life is lost in silence. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us follow Holmes into the corridors of fear and superstition, where reason must pierce the veil of dread. It was upon one of those bleak mornings when the fog hung low upon the river and pressed heavily against the windows of Baker Street that I found my friend absorbed, as was so often the case, in the minute examination of some chemical preparation. The fire in our grate had sunk to a dull glow, casting long shadows across the littered table, while Holmes, his brow furrowed and his thin fingers poised with delicate precision, seemed utterly oblivious to the dreariness without. I had taken refuge behind my newspaper when the bell below announced a visitor. The sound was hurried, almost desperate, and a moment later Mrs. Hudson ushered into our sitting room a gentleman whose manner betrayed an agitation wholly at variance with the usual formality of such calls. The stranger's appearance was striking, not from any peculiarity of dress, for he was attired with the precision of one accustomed to society, but from the tremor that shook his hands as he removed his gloves and the pallor that seemed to drain the vigor from his face. His eyes, large and dark, darted restlessly about the room, settling at last with a kind of imploring intensity upon Holmes. Even in those first moments, I could discern that here was a man who had looked upon some experience of a singularly unsettling nature, the memory of which still clung to him like a shadow. Holmes, without rising, motioned him to the armchair opposite, while I could not help but mark the effort with which the gentleman composed himself, as though the very act of sitting in our presence demanded the summoning of all his reserves of strength. For a time he remained silent, his gaze fixed upon the carpet, his fingers nervously interlacing, as though words, once spoken, might summon again the terror from which he sought escape. At length, in a voice strained and uncertain, he declared that he came not upon any ordinary matter of theft or fraud, but upon one that touched upon the uncanny. He faltered, his eyes shifting to mine as if expecting disbelief, and indeed I felt a smile tug at the corners of my lips before I checked it. "It may seem to you, gentlemen," said he, "no more than an idle superstition, a folly whispered by servants and scoffed at by men of sense, yet I assure you that what I have witnessed is no common fancy." Holmes inclined his head gravely, offering no interruption, though his grey eyes had brightened with that peculiar light which ever heralded his keenest interest. Thus encouraged, our visitor, who gave his name as Sir Reginald Ashcombe of Gloucestershire, began the recital of the scene that had so disturbed his peace. His family seat, Ashcombe Hall, had hosted a dinner of some 12 guests, friends and relations, gathered beneath the high-beamed ceiling of its ancient dining chamber. The long oak table had glittered with crystal and silver, yet even amidst the merriment an unease had settled upon the company. "There is a tradition in our household," he continued, "that no banquet should ever number 13. It is an old belief, born of generations past, that such a company must inevitably invite disaster. Imagine, then, the consternation when, through a late arrival, the butler was compelled to bring forth an additional chair and place it, reluctantly, at the end of the board." Sir Reginald's features tightened as he spoke, for it was evident that in his mind the memory of that 13th chair was indissolubly bound with the calamity that followed. "The meal had scarcely reached its third course," said Sir Reginald in a lowered tone, "when gaiety was extinguished as though a cloud had passed across the sun. My cousin, a hale and cheerful man but moments before, gave a sudden gasp, his face contorted with pain, and clutching at the table, he fell senseless to the floor. The servants rushed forward, but no remedy availed, for in an instant he was beyond aid. It was as if death himself had taken a seat amongst us, and every eye turned upon that fatal 13th chair. Ladies shrieked, men muttered in horror, and I confess, gentlemen, that even I felt the chill of some unearthly agency in that dreadful moment. Since that hour, the house has been paralyzed by fear. Servants whisper of curses, and the very walls seem steeped in dread. As he spoke these words, his hand trembled so violently that the glass of water before him quivered audibly upon the table. Sir Reginald paused, his voice faltering under the weight of his recollections. He leaned forward, his gaze imploring Holmes with a mixture of desperation and shame. "I am not a credulous man," he said hoarsely. "I have seen service. I have endured hardships, yet this horror has unsettled me beyond bearing. I beg you, Mr. Holmes, look beyond the childish terrors that have ensnared my household. Tell me whether my cousin's death was the working of blind chance, the hand of Providence, or some darker contrivance of human design. Only then may the fear that grips Ashcombe Hall be lifted." His words rang with sincerity, and I confess I felt a stir of sympathy, though the notion of a curse upon a chair seemed, to my mind, absurd. Holmes, who had listened throughout with an expression of profound absorption, now rose and placed his fingertips together with that peculiar gesture of decision I knew so well. "Sir Reginald," said he with calm assurance, "superstition, when probed with a clear eye, most often conceals deliberate hands. I shall undertake your case, and we shall see whether this 13th chair owes its ill fame to chance or to contrivance." Sir Reginald leaned forward in his chair, his hands pressed tightly together as he resumed his account. "It was, gentlemen," said he, "an occasion of some ceremony, though confined to the circle of my family and a few trusted acquaintances. The dining hall at Ashcombe is of noble proportions, its carved ceiling and ancient tapestries lending a gravity to any gathering held beneath its roof. That evening, the long oak table, blackened by centuries, was set with silver so polished that it caught the flame of the candles and scattered it into 100 glittering points of light. 12 of us were seated there, a company chosen with care, cousins, old friends of the family, and a neighbour of some distinction. At first, all proceeded with a decorous gaiety. The talk flowed easily, the glasses chimed, and the warmth of companionship seemed to dispel the shadows that ever linger in such a venerable chamber. Yet even in the first hour, a faint sense of unease seemed to stir beneath the surface, as if some unseen presence waited for its moment to intrude. It was then, Sir Reginald continued, that we were informed of the arrival of a 13th guest, an acquaintance whose invitation had been delayed in delivery. My butler, an old and superstitious fellow, hesitated visibly when compelled to bring in another chair. I heard him mutter under his breath that no good ever came of a table so numbered. Though I rebuked him for his foolishness, I could not help but observe that several of the company exchanged uneasy glances. The 13th chair was fetched from a recess, its dark frame drawn reluctantly into line with the others, and placed at the lower end of the board. A hush fell upon the gathering for a brief instant, broken only by a strained jest or two, which rang the hollower for the anxiety it sought to disguise. From that moment forward, it seemed to me that the very atmosphere of the feast had altered, as though the air itself had grown heavier. Despite this shadow, the dinner resumed, and for a time the sound of music and laughter rose once more. A violinist in attendance played a light air between courses, and the conversation turned toward politics and sport. Yet I could not, even in the retelling, free myself of the impression that a subtle tension pervaded the company. Though smiles adorned their lips, the eyes of several guests wandered ever back to the 13th seat, as though expecting some dire manifestation. One lady dropped her fan and started violently when it clattered to the floor. Another guest spilt a drop of wine upon the tablecloth and whispered a hurried apology with more fervour than the accident required. It was as if each trivial occurrence acquired a weight wholly disproportionate, magnified by the lurking dread of the ill-omened number. Holmes listened with his customary stillness, while I confess that to me the account bore the stamp of nervous imagination more than of reason. Sir Reginald's voice sank lower as he recalled those minutes. There were whispers, half caught, of fortune ill-starred, of warnings disregarded, of omens that cling to houses as ivy clings to stone. One guest, I observed, kept his gaze fixed upon the newcomer with an intensity that ill-accorded with courtesy. Another spoke in guarded tones of an inheritance long disputed, and his words carried an edge that chilled the air around him. I tell you, gentlemen, that though the feast continued outwardly in proper form, beneath it ran a current of suspicion and unease, which every man present felt, though none dared openly acknowledge. I myself was torn between rebuking their folly and yielding to it. It was in this strained silence that the shadow which had hovered over us descended in full weight. Holmes's eyes had narrowed to slits, and though he spoke not a word, I could see that every detail was fastened in that extraordinary memory of his. "It came without warning," said Sir Reginald, his hands shaking as he spoke. "One of our company, my cousin, had just risen to propose a toast when his voice faltered. His hand, which held the goblet aloft, trembled violently, and in the next moment he staggered, clutching at the table for support. His face blanched to an ashen hue, his eyes rolled back, and he fell with a dreadful sound upon the floor. The goblet slipped from his grasp, striking the board and sending a crimson flood of wine streaming across the white cloth like a cruel mimicry of blood. For an instant there was silence, stunned and awful, before the hall erupted into confusion. Ladies shrieked, men sprang from their seats, and the musicians dropped their instruments with a discordant crash. Yet in that first instant of horror, every gaze turned not upon the fallen man, but upon that 13th chair, which seemed to sit in mute accusation at the end of the table. What followed was a scene of the wildest disorder. Chairs were thrust back in haste, their legs grating harshly on the oaken floor. Servants rushed forward, their voices raised in alarm, while the guests pressed in confusion about the stricken man. Some cried for a physician, others muttered of a curse fulfilled, and still others stood paralyzed, incapable of movement. Sir Reginald admitted that he himself was shaken to the very core, for though he struggled to command his household, the contagion of fear had spread too swiftly to be mastered. The shadow of the 13th seat hung over all. It was whispered, pointed at, avoided, as though it were a living accomplice in the tragedy that had just unfolded. When Sir Reginald fell silent, the recollection having taxed his composure, I could not refrain from remarking that such a tale was but the natural offspring of imagination, overstrained by grief. Holmes, however, made no such dismissal. He sat with his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon some inner vision. At last he spoke, his tone even and unhurried. "It is not the number of chairs, my dear Watson, nor yet the fancies of servants that should concern us," said he. "It is their arrangement. In that, I fancy, lies the crux of the matter." His words fell quietly, yet with a weight that seemed to shift the whole direction of the tale, and I realized that for Holmes the case had already begun to shape itself into lines invisible to the rest of us. It was upon the following morning that Holmes and I set out for Ashcombe Hall, Sir Reginald having preceded us to make the necessary arrangements. A pale mist lay thick upon the countryside, shrouding the hedgerows and hanging low upon the fields, so that each tree loomed like some spectral sentinel. As we drew nearer our destination, the outlines of the old estate began to emerge through the vapour, its turrets and chimneys rising darkly above the rolling fog. There was in its vast and solemn silhouette something that struck me with a sense of foreboding, as though the very stones were steeped in the memories of grief and fear. Holmes, sitting opposite me in the carriage, had drawn his coat about him, his chin sunk upon his breast, yet I observed the quick flicker of his eyes beneath their half-closed lids. For myself, I confess to a tightening of the heart, for the journey seemed less a progress through English fields than an approach to some theatre of dread. At our arrival, we were met by Sir Reginald, whose manner betrayed a weariness that bespoke sleepless hours. The servants who attended us moved with subdued haste, their eyes downcast, as though the gloom of the recent tragedy had robbed the household of all animation. The corridors through which we were led were long and echoing, their portraits darkened by the passage of time, and the air heavy with the scent of age and disuse. It struck me with peculiar force that the grandeur of the place, once no doubt splendid, had taken on a melancholy aspect, as though the house itself mourned its dead. Holmes, however, paid scant attention to such impressions, his gaze flitting from one architectural detail to another with the alertness of a man already tracing the outlines of an unseen pattern. Presently we came to the dining chamber, and at the threshold both Holmes and I paused. The long oak table was still set in a grim semblance of order, the places untouched since that fateful night, as though awaiting the return of those who would never gather there again. The silver and crystal caught the dim light, yet lent no cheer. Rather, they glittered with a cold and funereal brilliance. My eyes were drawn irresistibly to the lower end of the board, where the 13th chair stood somewhat apart, its emptiness charged with a significance that pressed upon the spirit. The silence in the chamber was profound, broken only by the faint creak of a shutter stirring in the draught. I confess that I felt a chill pass over me, for it seemed that the very air bore the residue of terror, and that we intruded upon a scene not yet at rest. While I remained rooted to that solemn spot, Holmes moved lightly into the room, his keen gaze passing swiftly over every detail. He bent to examine the arrangement of the chairs, running his hand along the back of one, and then paced slowly round the table with the measured tread of a man upon familiar ground. He stooped to study the carpet, his eyes tracing the faint depressions left by heavy feet, and paused at the 13th seat, where he lingered with marked attention. His long fingers hovered over the carved arms, and he tilted his head as if listening to some whisper inaudible to my duller senses. To me, the chamber was a tomb of silence and foreboding, but to Holmes it was a page written in a cipher which he alone possessed the art to read. It was then that Holmes beckoned me nearer with the slightest inclination of his head. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. I bent and perceived, though only with effort, that upon the polished boards beneath the chair, faint scratches ran in a direction slightly awry from the others, as if it had been dragged into place with unusual force. "Note, too," he added, "the subtle displacement in line. It is not where a servant, setting a place in haste, would naturally place it." He touched the carpet with the point of his finger. "Here is the indentation of its former position, and there, scarcely visible, the pressure of a heel that rested too long." His tone was low, yet his words carried a weight that impressed themselves indelibly upon my mind. What seemed to me but trifles were to him eloquent witnesses, testifying without speech to a design both deliberate and sinister. At the doorway, I became aware of several servants who had crept after us with timid curiosity. They exchanged whispers, casting fearful glances at the table, and one muttered audibly of the curse that clung to the 13th place. Their awe and dread were palpable, a contagion that stirred even my own reason with unease. Holmes straightened, his keen profile set in an expression of cold disdain. "Let them mutter of curses," said he quietly to me. "It is ever easier to ascribe to unseen forces what may be laid at the door of human cunning. Fear, Watson, is the mask most willingly worn when truth proves less convenient." His words, delivered with calm finality, seemed to silence the servants, who withdrew, crossing themselves as they went. Holmes remained for a moment in profound contemplation, then with a sudden movement turned upon his heel and made for the door. As we stepped once more into the dim corridor, his face was unreadable, the grey eyes narrowed in thought. "Chairs, my dear Watson," he said at last, with the faintest smile playing about his lips, "are not moved for reasons of comfort alone. There are hands that shift them for purposes far less innocent." With that enigmatic observation, he fell into silence, leaving me to follow with a mind more perplexed than ever, and with a foreboding sense that the mystery of Ashcombe Hall had only begun to unfold its darker depths. At Holmes's request, Sir Reginald assembled the company of guests who had been present at that fatal dinner. We met in a sombre drawing-room, whose heavy curtains admitted but a dim light, and where the air itself seemed weighted with restraint. Though courtesy compelled a semblance of composure, I could discern beneath the surface a current of unease that made itself felt in the quickened breath, the tapping fingers, the restless shifting of feet upon the carpet. Polite speech faltered, and silence, when it came, was longer than etiquette required. Holmes, seated with apparent languor in a high-backed chair, surveyed the gathering with eyes that missed nothing. For myself, I could not help but be struck by the tension that bound these men and women together. Each sought to appear indifferent, yet all betrayed in some manner the consciousness that suspicion hovered over the room like an invisible presence. The first to speak was a gentleman whose anxious mien and haggard features bespoke long acquaintance with care. He was pressed by Holmes, with gentle insistence, to recount his recollections of that evening. His words came haltingly, punctuated by awkward pauses, and his hands, which clutched at his watch chain, betrayed the tremor of suppressed agitation. He confessed, with a bitterness that ill-concealed humiliation, that he had debts which weighed heavily upon him, and that his deceased cousin had been less than charitable when pressed for assistance. There was in his tone a note of resentment, sharpened by desperation. And though he hastened to protest his affection, it was evident to all that the relations between them had not been unclouded. Holmes listened with impassive face, offering neither encouragement nor censure, yet I could not help but feel that this disclosure placed him, in my mind at least, in a position both pitiable and suspicious. Next came a lady of fashion, whose dress and manner proclaimed her accustomed to admiration. Yet, when Holmes addressed to her a question concerning the late hours of that night, I perceived a sudden flush upon her cheek, followed by a quick glance toward one of the gentlemen present. She sought to compose herself, speaking with studied lightness, yet her voice wavered, and her hands toyed nervously with the fringe of her shawl. The glance was not lost upon Holmes, whose gaze followed hers with quiet interest. There was in her account no overt falsehood, yet her embarrassment betrayed some concealed entanglement. I confess I was struck by the awkwardness of her denials, and though I could not have defined it, I felt instinctively that her position in the affair was not free of danger. Here, surely, was matter that might lead to scandal if probed too deeply. A distant cousin of the deceased was next invited to give his recollection. He was a man of smooth speech, and he spoke with an ease that contrasted sharply with the discomposure of those before him. Yet beneath the polished phrases there lurked a bitterness which he strove in vain to conceal. He admitted, with a faint smile, that the inheritance had long been the subject of family speculation, and though he sought to turn the matter into jest, the envy that coloured his words was too plain to be missed. I observed the narrowing of Holmes's eyes as he listened, and I confess that in that moment I thought we had touched upon the very root of the tragedy. For what motive is more ancient or more enduring than that of greed? Yet Holmes remained silent, betraying no sign of assent, and I was left to wrestle with my own suspicions. It was upon the entrance of the foreign guest, however, that the atmosphere took on a deeper solemnity. He was a tall, austere figure, with eyes that seemed to gaze beyond the company into some realm unseen. His manner was reserved, his replies brief, yet each was tinged with an enigmatic quality that set the company whispering. Rumour had already marked him as a dabbler in occult practices, and when, in answer to Holmes's inquiry, he spoke vaguely of fates that are not to be averted, and the number that summons death, I confess that a shudder passed through me. The others exchanged uneasy glances, as though his words confirmed their darkest imaginings. To my mind, here was the sinister agent of the mischief, cloaked in the very trappings of superstition that had haunted the house. Yet Holmes, though he inclined his head politely, gave no outward sign that he was impressed by these cryptic utterances. When the foreign visitor had withdrawn, I could not refrain from leaning toward Holmes and whispering my conviction that here lay the true clue to the tragedy. "Surely," I said, "such dark words and singular bearing point to the very heart of the matter." Holmes smiled faintly, his expression one of mingled amusement and pity. "My dear Watson," he murmured. Superstition is off the mask of baser motives. Men will cloak their designs in mystery, that their simplest acts may appear the work of destiny. Let us not be misled by phrases, however solemnly uttered. His tone was calm, almost indifferent, yet I knew from long experience that he had already weighed the words of the foreigner and found them wanting. Still, I could not wholly free my own mind from the impression left by that strange presence. At length, the company was dismissed, each departing with an air of relief that the ordeal was ended. Holmes remained seated, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed upon the fading embers of the fire. I ventured to ask whether he discerned now the solution. He shook his head slowly. "Each guest," said he, "has furnished a strand, but the pattern is not yet woven. Until it is complete, judgment would be premature." His words fell with the quiet weight of conviction, and though I pressed him no further, I felt more than ever that we stood upon the threshold of a design whose darker outlines I could not yet perceive. The mystery, far from lessening, had only deepened, and I retired that night with my mind filled with a tangle of suspicions from which I could find no release. Sir Reginald's features grew pale as the memory returned, and for some moments he seemed unable to proceed. At length, mastering his emotion, he spoke in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "There was, gentlemen, one circumstance which I have not yet related. My cousin, though he lay senseless upon the floor, was not wholly gone at the first. He stirred faintly, as though some remnant of life still clung to him, and with lips that barely moved he uttered a phrase, broken, hushed, and at first unintelligible to those who bent above him. Several of us leaned close, straining to catch the words, but death overtook him before more could be said. The sound was so feeble, so indistinct, that at the time I scarcely credited it. Yet when afterward it was repeated to me by others who had heard, I realized that those faltering syllables might hold the key to the whole dreadful affair." Sir Reginald paused, his eyes fixed upon Holmes, as if dreading the effect of the revelation. With evident effort, he brought forth the words. They swore that what he said was this, "Not mine, the 13th." As the phrase fell upon our ears, a silence followed, heavy with unease. For my own part, I confess that the odd construction bewildered me. It seemed at once elliptical and obscure, as though fragments of meaning had been torn from some greater whole. Sir Reginald repeated it slowly, as if hoping by sheer enunciation to wring sense from it, but the result was only to deepen the perplexity. The guests, he said, had looked at one another with growing dread, for in those words they heard some mysterious reference to the fatal chair. To my mind, neither grammar nor logic lent itself to a rational interpretation, and yet the conviction pressed upon me that in those broken syllables some dreadful truth had found utterance in the instant of death. Sir Reginald went on to describe the reaction of the company in the moments that followed. The words, repeated from mouth to mouth, became the subject of heated conjecture. One declared that they were the utterance of a soul passing into the unseen, a final omen to be heeded with fear. Another whispered that they were meant as an accusation, a denial of guilt cast upon another in his dying moment. A third muttered of curses that cling to families and of numbers which foretell doom. The drawing room, filled with those agitated voices, had taken on an air of superstition and dread, and each guest sought to thrust the burden of meaning upon another. From all quarters arose suggestions of hidden crimes, of secret grudges, of fate itself descending to strike the company. To me, the whole resembled a babel of terrified conjecture, in which fear found voice more readily than reason. I confess that even as I listened to Sir Reginald's account, my own mind laboured vainly to interpret the phrase. Was it, I asked myself, a disclaimer of responsibility? Not mine, as though he denied some charge at the last? Did the 13th refer merely to the seat, ominous in its position at the board? Or had he spoken not of a number, but of a person, concealed beneath that cryptic epithet? Again and again I rehearsed the words in my mind, altering emphasis, shifting meaning, yet no construction yielded a solution that satisfied. It seemed to me that we were confronted not merely with the difficulty of an incomplete sentence, but with the deeper puzzle of a man who, on the edge of death, sought to convey more than his failing lips could utter. The more I considered, the more bewildered I became, until I almost envied those who saw in it no more than the mutterings of a soul departing. Throughout this narration, Holmes had remained in his chair, his fingers steepled before him, his gaze fixed upon the table, as though it contained some secret not yet disclosed. He made no interruption, nor did his features betray the least impatience. Only the quick, darting movements of his eyes showed that his mind was engaged upon some process invisible to us. To me, accustomed as I was to his methods, the silence was more eloquent than speech. I knew that each word, each inflection, each contradiction had been weighed and stored in that singular mind. Yet he offered no comment, no clue by which I might judge whether he found in the phrase aught of value. The quiet in the room grew oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the fire, and I found myself longing that he would speak and relieve the tension which pressed so heavily upon us. Sir Reginald, growing restless under Holmes's silence, at last ventured to ask his opinion. Holmes turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "The dead, Sir Reginald," said he, "do not always speak in riddles, though the living mistake them so. Words falter, meanings slip, and what seems obscure may in time prove simple." He uttered this with a calmness that suggested more than it revealed. I could not but feel a pang of disappointment, for the remark seemed at once to admit significance and to deny us its revelation. Holmes leaned back once more, his eyes returning to their fixed abstraction, and Sir Reginald subsided with a sigh of mingled relief and frustration. To me, the sense of mystery grew only deeper, for if Holmes had discerned a clue, he had no intention of sharing it until his chain of reasoning was complete. When at last our interview drew to its close, I walked beside Holmes in silence, my mind haunted by those three strange words. Far from clarifying the affair, they had thrown around it a darker veil, a veil of human fear and superstition interwoven with threads I could not unravel. I confessed my perplexity to Holmes, who merely observed that the phrase must remain unspoken until the time was ripe. "We have fragments, Watson," said he, "but not yet the whole. Until each piece has found its place, speculation is idle." With that, he fell silent, leaving me to wrestle with my own unanswered questions. The whisper of the dying man echoed in my ears as we quitted the chamber, and I knew that the shadows which gathered about Ashcombe Hall had only thickened in their obscurity. It was at Holmes's urging that we returned to the dining chamber when the household had retired, and the corridors of Ashcombe Hall lay in silence. The lamps had been extinguished, save for the single lantern we carried, whose narrow beams served only to accentuate the gloom. The air was heavy with that peculiar stillness which attends an old house at night. Every creak of board and whisper of draught seemed magnified into menace. Sir Reginald, though visibly reluctant, accompanied us, his countenance pale as the light flickered across it. "Surely, Mr. Holmes," he whispered, "such things are better left till daylight." Holmes shook his head with quiet emphasis. "There are truths, Sir Reginald, which show themselves more readily in shadow than in sun." Thus we entered again the chamber of death, the long table looming before us in spectral array, the 13th chair standing mutely at its appointed place, as though awaiting the return of its victim. Holmes advanced without hesitation to the lower end of the table and stationed himself before the ill-omened chair. I remained somewhat behind, conscious of a curious reluctance to approach it, as though the object itself radiated the dread with which it had been invested. Holmes, however, bent low, his lantern held close, and with the calm deliberation of a man intent upon a problem of geometry, he measured the position of the chair against the faint scratches we had already observed upon the polished floor. "It has been shifted," he murmured, more to himself than to us. not once, but repeatedly, and always to the same alignment. He traced with his long finger the faint parallel lines which bore silent testimony to deliberate adjustment. Here, Watson, we have not the hand of chance, but of intention. The words, spoken in that coldly precise tone, sent through me a thrill of mingled awe and foreboding. Holmes next directed the lantern's glow along the carved arms of the chair, where my unpracticed eye saw nothing but the ordinary tracery of wood. With the aid of his magnifying lens, however, he revealed to us minute notches cut into the surface, slight abrasions so delicate they would have escaped any casual glance. At one point, close beneath the curving rest, he halted, and with the fine tip of his instrument traced what proved to be the smallest of boreholes, cunningly concealed amidst the pattern of the carving. "Note, Watson, the varnish here," said he. "See where it has been disturbed and renewed with unskillful hand. The sheen is broken, the grain imperfect." I bent close and, though at first incredulous, was compelled at length to acknowledge the accuracy of his observation. It was plain that some artifice had been contrived, though its nature I could not yet comprehend. I marvelled once again at those faculties which saw significance where mine discerned only trifles. Having satisfied himself upon these points, Holmes produced from his pocket a delicate instrument resembling a surgeon's probe, and with the utmost care inserted it into the minute aperture he had discovered. His movements were those of a man handling an object at once fragile and dangerous. Withdrawing it gently, he introduced the lens once more, and then, by the application of slight pressure upon the armrest, caused a scarcely audible click. "Observe," he said softly. The wood seemed to yield imperceptibly, and in that instant I perceived that the chair concealed within its frame a mechanism of the most subtle and devilish ingenuity. Holmes repeated the action, demonstrating that the pressure of an unsuspecting arm would be sufficient to bring it into play. My heart quickened as I watched, for I felt that we stood upon the verge of the discovery which would strip the tragedy of its cloak of superstition and reveal it for what it truly was. Holmes's probe, applied with steady hand, elicited from the recess a slender steel needle, so fine as to be all but invisible against the dark wood. With infinite caution, he drew it forth, and in the lantern's glow the tip gleamed faintly, betraying a residue that clung with sinister suggestion. He lifted it to his nostrils, inhaled delicately, and nodded. "An alkaloid," he said. "One of the most virulent, swift, subtle, and not easily traced." I shuddered, for the image of Sir Reginald's cousin collapsing amidst the laughter and light of the feast rose vividly before me. Holmes continued, "The merest puncture, the briefest contact, and the work is done. Death enters as silently as a thief in the night." He replaced the needle with scrupulous care, his features composed, yet in his eyes there burned that light of intellectual triumph which I had so often observed at moments of revelation. For myself, the horror of it struck with irresistible force. Here was no spectral agency, no curse descending from the unseen, but the cold and deliberate contrivance of man. I felt a chill as I pictured the unsuspecting victim, resting his arm in ease upon that fatal spot, unconscious of the doom concealed within the carved wood beneath his hand. The superstition that had paralyzed the household was but the mask under which the murderer's artifice had operated. I confess that a sickness overcame me, and I turned away for a moment, lest my agitation betray itself. To think that the terror of the 13th chair was no phantasm of chance, but the outcome of deliberate malice, was a revelation at once appalling and profoundly sobering. Holmes, meanwhile, restored the mechanism to its place with meticulous precision, so that to all appearance the chair was as innocent as the rest. He extinguished the lantern, leaving the chamber once more to its shadows, and as we turned to depart, he spoke in that level tone which masked so much. The 13th chair owed its danger not to number, but to design. We are now within reach of the hand that fashioned it, and soon enough that hand must betray itself. With this enigmatic assurance, he strode into the corridor, leaving me to follow, my mind filled with awe at the depth of human cunning and the darker mystery that yet awaited its unravelling. At Holmes's instruction, Sir Reginald caused the entire household and such guests as still remained to be gathered in the great dining chamber. It was late in the afternoon, and the one light that filtered through the high windows lent to the scene a pallor more suggestive of a mortuary than of a family gathering. I confess to a shiver as I re-entered that fateful room, for the long oak table stretched before us in gloomy magnificence, while at its far end the 13th chair seemed to sit like some silent witness awaiting to give its testimony. The company, assembled in uneasy array, took their places with reluctance. None would venture too near the fatal seat, so that it remained isolated, a sinister object about which their eyes continually strayed. Holmes, tall and commanding at the head of the table, surveyed them with that cold composure which gave to his presence an authority none could question. The atmosphere was charged with suppressed excitement. I marked the furtive glances that passed from one face to another, the half-stifled whispers that died away at Holmes's first movement. There was, among them all, a nervous avoidance of speech, as though each feared his words might be twisted into an accusation. One guest, unable to endure the silence, laughed abruptly, but the sound jarred discordantly and was met with frowns. I too felt the oppression of that dreadful chamber where tragedy lingered like an invisible miasma. The 13th chair loomed ever before us, its emptiness more eloquent than speech, and I fancied that more than one of the company dared not even turn his back upon it. The suspense grew intolerable, until Holmes, raising his hand, compelled the room into stillness and fixed each trembling soul beneath the steady fire of his gaze. "My friends," said he in a voice calm and resonant, "you have been haunted by a belief that a curse descended upon this household, embodied in the 13th chair. Permit me to assure you that no curse rests upon wood or number. What you have witnessed was no visitation from without, but the cunning design of a human brain. That seat was not ill-fated by chance. It was prepared, altered, and placed with a purpose as deliberate as it was malignant. The scratches upon the floor, the unnatural shift in its position, and the tampering of its carved arm are all the work of hands, not of spirits. Superstition has served its turn in cloaking the truth, but today it shall serve no longer." His words, delivered with unflinching certainty, fell like cold water upon heated fancy, and I could see the expressions of awe and terror change slowly into the darker hues of apprehension. Holmes resumed in that quiet, judicial tone which never failed to compel attention. "In the course of my inquiries, I have heard much of envy, of debts unpaid, of secrets guarded with anxious care. Each of you, I do not doubt, has something you would prefer remained concealed. The gentleman who wrestles with creditors, his bitterness was plain. The lady whose glances betrayed her entanglement, her secret is of another kind. And the cousin whose smooth speech could not wholly disguise resentment at a lost inheritance, his motive lies bare upon the surface. Yet consider, each of these, however plausible, fails in one essential particular. Not one had the opportunity to prepare so intricate a contrivance as this chair presents. Idle words, hidden liaisons, and financial woes are common enough in society, but a mechanism such as this demands both access and time. And those, gentlemen, are not gifts bestowed equally among you." At this, Holmes stepped to the 13th seat, and with a gesture commanded the company's attention. Producing from his pocket the delicate probe I had seen him use before, he applied it to the carved armrest. A faint click sounded, scarce audible in the hush, and to the astonishment of all present, the slender needle slid forth from its hiding place, gleaming wickedly in the fading light. Gasps of horror broke from the onlookers as Holmes explained in clear, measured tones the operation of the device, how the weight of an arm, resting naturally, would depress a concealed spring, releasing the poisoned sting with fatal certainty. "A mechanism of diabolical ingenuity," said he, "and one which leaves its victim to fall as though struck by sudden seizure, while suspicion is diverted to phantoms of superstition." He replaced the probe, and the company shrank visibly from the chair, as though it had transformed from an object of dread into one of loathing. Then, with a suddenness that startled all, Holmes turned his gaze full upon the victim's cousin, a man who had hitherto borne himself with a composure bordering upon arrogance. "And who, sir," said Holmes sternly, "but you possessed both the motive and the means. The fortune that fell to your kinsman stood between you and solvency. You alone had access to the room when preparations could be made. And you, sir, bear upon your cuff the faint trace of varnish, clumsily wiped, which betrays your tampering with the arm of this chair." The accused started violently, his face paling to a ghastly hue. He stammered a denial, but Holmes pressed forward with unrelenting precision, detailing each circumstance: the inheritance motive, the knowledge of the household arrangements, the opportunity afforded by his solitary rambles within the hall. Each word drove the man nearer to collapse, until the mask of assurance crumbled, and his eyes darted wildly about the room, seeking escape. For a few moments he struggled, first with defiance, then with despair. His lips trembled with incoherent protestations, but the trembling of his hands and the sweat upon his brow spoke more plainly than words. At last, with a cry that seemed wrung from the depths of his being, he confessed in broken phrases, alternately railing against the injustice of fortune and pleading for mercy from those assembled. The company recoiled, horrified alike at the crime and at the nearness of the criminal who had moved among them with so plausible an air. Ladies turned pale, gentlemen muttered in indignation, and Sir Reginald sank into his chair, overcome by the enormity of the revelation. The weight of certainty had fallen upon us all, and there could be no mistaking the deliberate hand that had wrought this kinslaying. When order had been in some measure restored, and the wretched man placed in secure custody, Holmes turned to me with that half-ironical smile which so often played about his lips in the aftermath of triumph. "You perceive, Watson, how easily men surrender their judgment to the tyranny of superstition. A number at table, a whisper of fate, and reason is silenced. Yet behind the veil there lurks only the old story: greed, envy, and the cunning of man. Superstition served here as the curtain, but the hand that drew it was very human." He spoke without exultation, as one who states a melancholy fact, and as we quitted that chamber of dread, I reflected upon the strange irony that the terror of a curse had cloaked the basest of motives. Thus ended the exposure, but I knew well that for Sir Reginald and his household, the shadow of the 13th chair would long remain. The events of that day left the household of Ashcombe Hall in a condition of hushed confusion. When at last Holmes declared that our task there was ended, we prepared to take our leave. The corridors through which we passed were dim and chill, echoing faintly to our steps. Servants moved softly about their duties, their voices subdued, as though the very walls might carry gossip of the crime. Among the guests who remained, there was an air of subdued relief mingled with weariness, for the dreadful burden of suspicion, though lifted from many shoulders, had left a heaviness that time alone could lighten. Sir Reginald himself parted from us with a pressure of the hand and words of gratitude, which, though heartfelt, seemed faint in the face of so deep a wound. As we stepped into the open air, I felt as though we had emerged from a mausoleum, where tragedy had written its sombre record in silence rather than in stone. Our carriage bore us away from the hall, the wheels crunching upon the gravel with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the brooding stillness. The countryside was wrapped in a dense fog that clung to the hedgerows and drifted across the fields in wavering veils. It was a scene peculiarly suited to reflection, for the mystery we had unravelled still pressed heavily upon my thoughts. As I watched the pale outlines of trees looming and vanishing in the shifting vapour, I could not but muse on the power of that superstition which had seized upon the 13th chair. The merest accident of number had sufficed to paralyse a household, and even now, with the truth revealed, the memory of it would long haunt those corridors. I remarked to Holmes that there was in such beliefs a strange vitality, outlasting reason and defying proof, so that men of intelligence were no less enthralled by them than the most credulous of servants. "Indeed, Holmes," I said, "the hold of superstition seems proof against argument. We may reason against it, demonstrate its folly, yet still men cling to it. Perhaps it is that we find in omens a kind of comfort, however illusory. For chance, when faced bare, is intolerable, and death, when stripped of its mystery, is too stark a companion. To clothe such terrors in the garb of omen and curse is to give them form, and thus to make them less formlessly dreadful. The number 13, a black cat, the breaking of a mirror, these things stand as symbols which the mind can grasp. Without them, men would be forced to confront accident and mortality in their naked horror. Better, perhaps, to believe that fate arranges our misfortunes than to acknowledge that they strike without pattern or warning." As I spoke, I was conscious of the futility of such musings, yet the thought clung to me with a melancholy insistence, born of the tragedy we had left behind. Holmes, who had listened with half-closed eyes and the faintest smile upon his lips, now straightened and replied in his clear, incisive manner. "You put it well, Watson, but you err in regarding superstition merely as solace. It is more than that, it is a weapon. See how readily men cloak their designs in the veil of the uncanny, confident that others will shrink from probing further. It affords to cunning minds the cover they most desire. The very absurdity of superstition serves their purpose, for once fear is aroused, reason is silenced." In the case we have just concluded, a mechanism of singular ingenuity was permitted to operate undetected because its stage was set beneath the shadow of a supposed curse. Men will accept any marvel, however grotesque, rather than look too closely at the hand that moves it. Thus it is that superstition, far from being a mere folly, becomes in the wrong hands a most effective instrument of crime. He leaned back, and I could see the light of reminiscence in his eyes. "This is not the first occasion, Watson, upon which we have seen the ghostly and the marvellous invoked to mask the basest of motives. You recall, perhaps, the hound that haunted Dartmoor, and the serpent that crept in the night at Stoke Moran. In each instance, superstition served as both veil and decoy, permitting guilt to prosper until torn aside by investigation. It is a pattern as old as human credulity, and I doubt not it will endure while mankind prefers the phantasm to the fact. Yet there is to me a certain irony in it, that those who pride themselves on subtlety must ever lean upon the very follies they affect to despise. Were men less credulous, crime would be driven to far more honest devices." He chuckled softly, though there was little mirth in the sound. Holmes grew thoughtful once more. In this affair, it was not the number of the chair that carried death, but the greed of one man who sought by artifice to hasten his inheritance. The true curse upon Ashcombe Hall lay not in its furniture, but in envy, that oldest of human poisons. The 13th seat was but a stage upon which avarice played its part, and fear lent applause. Yet the superstition will endure, and I would wager that never again will any guest of that household willingly take it. Thus error perpetuates itself even when unmasked, for men prefer the cloak of mystery to the nakedness of truth. He said this, with a wry twist of the lips, as though he found in it both amusement and melancholy. It was near midnight when at last we reached our own familiar door in Baker Street. The fog had followed us even to London, curling along the pavements and dimming the lamps with its ghostly breath. Within our sitting room, however, the fire burned brightly, and Holmes, casting aside his travelling cloak, sank into his armchair with pipe in hand. I took my accustomed place opposite, and for a while we sat in companionable silence, the crackle of the coals the only sound. As I watched the play of firelight upon my friend's keen features, it seemed to me that the shadows of superstition which had so oppressed Ashcombe Hall were here dispelled. Holmes puffed thoughtfully at his pipe, his gaze lost in the flames, as though already his mind had passed from one solved mystery to another yet to come. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the glow of the fire playing across his sharp features, and exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "You see, Watson, how superstition served not as an explanation, but as a disguise. Men will bow to omens more readily than to reason, and it is under such shadows that greed most often thrives. I sat in silence, pondering his words, when a thought struck me. Had not the criminal's greatest folly been entrusting too much to fear itself? What do you think was his fatal mistake? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy unraveling Holmes's mysteries, be sure to subscribe and pass this story along to fellow lovers of the detective's art.